Reddit. What is the creepiest or most disturbing internet rabbit hole you've gone down, and why? Story 1. Just once for fun, the internet is an archive of everything, and that includes human tragedy. Sometimes the most disturbing rabbit holes aren't the ones that lead to conspiracies or hidden secrets, but the ones that simply document a person's slow, deliberate walk into their own personal hell. The most haunting one I ever fell down was a Reddit thread that served as a year-long diary of a man's self-destruction, all starting from a single, fatally arrogant idea. It didn't begin with a cry for help. It began with a confident, almost scientific proposition. A user, let's call him Mark, posted a new thread with a straightforward premise. He wrote that he had always been fascinated by heroin and believed its reputation as an instantly life-destroying substance was overblown. His thesis was simple. The drug's power was a myth perpetuated to scare people, and a person with genuine, unshakable willpower could try it once purely for the experience and then walk away unscathed. He announced that he was going to be the guinea pig in this experiment. He was mentally stable, his life was in a good place, and he was absolutely certain he was strong enough to do it just once for fun. Reddit's response was immediate and overwhelming. It was a tidal wave of pleading and desperate warnings from former addicts and the families of those who had been lost to the drug. They begged him not to do it. They told him his willpower would mean nothing, that he was walking into a trap he couldn't comprehend. They shared their own stories of ruin, of lives and families torn apart by the exact same just once mentality. Mark was completely unfazed. He responded to the comments with a calm, almost condescending tone. He thanked them for their concern, but dismissed their experiences as products of weaker minds or pre-existing emotional problems. He was different. He was in control. He promised to report back after the experiment was complete to prove them all wrong. A few days later, he posted an update. He had done it. His writing was euphoric, electric. He described the experience with an almost poetic reverence, the warm, blissful wave that washed over him. The feeling of every worry and pain in the world melting away into a state of perfect, serene contentment. It was, he wrote, the most beautiful feeling a human being could possibly experience. He ended the post with a triumphant, almost smug tone. The experiment was a success. He had satisfied his curiosity, and now it was over. He had proven his point. He was strong enough. For a few weeks the thread was quiet. Then, a new post appeared. Mark wrote that he had a particularly stressful week at work and had decided to use again, just one last time, to unwind. He was adamant that it wasn't a problem. It was a conscious, controlled choice to deploy the drug as a tool for relaxation. Reddit users' tone shifted from warning to a kind of weary sorrow. They knew what they were seeing. This was the second chapter in a story they had all read before. The diary of his descent unfolded over the next year. The posts became more frequent, the excuses more transparent. It was no longer a tool for relaxation. It was a crutch for every minor inconvenience in his life. A fight with his girlfriend, a bill he couldn't pay, a lonely weekend each was a reason to use. His confident, analytical tone rotted away, replaced by a raw defensive anger. He lashed out at anyone who questioned him, insisting he still had everything under control, even as his posts began to detail the crumbling of his life. He wrote about getting sick, the agonizing pains of withdrawal that he could only soothe with another dose. He mentioned losing his job. His girlfriend left. He wrote about selling his guitar, then his TV, then his laptop. Reddit became his only friend. The anonymous usernames the only ones left to witness his life being systematically dismantled. The confident explorer was gone, replaced by a desperate trapped addict. Eventually, the posts shifted from defense to despair. He started writing about wanting to quit. He would chronicle his attempts with harrowing details of days of vomiting, the cold sweats, the crippling depression, the feeling of his bones aching. The community would rally, flooding the thread with support and advice. He'd post that he was 3 days clean, and there would be a brief, hopeful celebration. A week later, a new post would appear, short and full of shame. A relapsed. The cycle of hope and failure repeated, over and over, each time grinding him down further. His last few posts were barely coherent, a rambling stream of self-hatred and hopelessness. He was a ghost of the man who had started the thread. His final post was a simple, heartbreaking apology to everyone for failing. And then, silence. The thread became a digital vigil. For weeks, then months, people would check back, posting messages into the void. "Mark, are you okay? Please let us know you're alive." The answer came nearly a year after his last post. A new user, claiming to be his sister, wrote a short, final entry. Mark had died of an overdose a few months earlier. She had found the thread on his computer and felt the people who had witnessed his fall deserved to know how it ended. Reading that thread from beginning to end was one of the most disturbing experiences I've ever had online. It was like watching a suicide note being written over the course of a year. It was a real-time, unfiltered documentation of a man who thought he could outsmart the devil, only to chronicle, in his own words, exactly how his soul was taken apart, piece by piece. Story 2. The Katana Man. The internet is full of strange people, but you usually encounter them in designated containment zones, weird forums, the comment sections of controversial videos, or obscure subreddits. You do want to expect to find a breadcrumb trail to a violent tragedy in the customer Q&A section for a stun gun on Amazon. My journey down this particular rabbit hole began with an act of mundane birthday shopping and ended with me staring at the mugshot of a man from my own city who had committed an unthinkable crime. My brother has a juvenile sense of humor, and for his birthday one year, I thought it would be funny to get him a gag gift, a cheap, comically oversized taser from Amazon. I found one, added it to my cart, and then, while browsing, I did what I often do. I started scrolling through the questions people had asked about the product. Most of it was the usual stuff. How long does the battery last? Is this legal in California? But one question caught my eye. It was simple, almost childlike in its curiosity. Does it hurt? The top voted answer was what sent me down the rabbit hole. It wasn't a simple yes, or a technical explanation. The reply read, in a deadpan matter-of-fact tone, "It does not. I've tased myself in the neck 30 times. I just stared at that sentence. It was so profoundly absurd, so far outside the realm of a normal product interaction, that my curiosity was immediately ignited. Who says that? Who does that? This wasn't just a review. It was a bizarre confession. I had to know more about the person who offered this piece of unhinged consumer advice. I clicked on his public Amazon profile name. The man's review history was a digital shrine to cheap, menacing objects. He had reviewed a full-size katana, several sets of throwing knives, a tactical combat vest, and various other pieces of low-budget weaponry. His reviews were all written in the same slightly off, overly earnest tone. He was clearly a man with a very specific and very sharp hobby. The taser comment wasn't an anomaly. It was a window into a strange and obsessive personality. At this point, I was just morbidly fascinated. The man's Amazon profile used his full real name. On a whim, I typed it into Facebook. A single profile popped up. The profile picture was a grainy photo of a man in his living room, grinning proudly while holding the exact katana he had reviewed on Amazon. It was him. The first jolt of unease hit me. This wasn't some anonymous internet troll. This was a real person. Then I noticed two things that turned my casual curiosity into genuine alarm. First, his profile listed his location. He was from my city. The knowledge that this strange man who tased himself in the neck and posed with swords lived somewhere nearby made the whole thing feel uncomfortably close to home. The second thing was his timeline. It was flooded with posts, but not from him. They were from dozens of other people, and the messages were a torrent of grief and rage. "I can't believe what you did," one read. "You are the devil. I hope you rot forever," said another. It was a wall of digital mourning and fury, all directed at this man. It was obvious that he had done something terrible. Something that had shattered the lives of the people leaving these comments. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. I had to know what happened. I opened a new tab and typed his name into Google. The top results were all news articles from local media outlets, published just a few weeks earlier. The headlines were shocking. Man arrested after fatal katana stabbing in apartment. I read the articles with a growing sense of surreal horror. The man from the Amazon reviews, the man from my city, had stabbed another man in the chest with his sword, killing him. He had fled the scene and was captured by police after a manhunt. The articles detailed his history of severe delusions and schizophrenia. This wasn't a simple act of violence. It was a tragedy born from a mind that had completely detached from reality. He was now in jail, and the articles mentioned he was finally getting the psychiatric help he so desperately needed. The final, chilling piece of the puzzle fell into place when I checked my own Amazon order history to see when I first stumbled upon his review. I had purchased the stun gun on July 31st. The date on the news article about the murder was July 25th. The crime had happened less than a week before I was casually reading his unhinged advice. When I was laughing at his bizarre comment about tasing himself in the neck, he was either on the run or sitting in a jail cell. His life and the life of his victim already destroyed. It was one of the most jarring journeys I've ever taken. In the span of about 20 minutes, I went from laughing at a funny online comment to reading the tragic details of a violent death and mental illness that had happened just a few miles from my own home. It was a stark reminder that even the most absurd corners of the internet are populated by real people, with real and sometimes devastating stories. Story 3. Breaking code, silence some rabbit holes, pull you in with mystery or horror. This one dragged me in with a quiet, heartbreaking story from my best friend, and it led to the infuriating discovery of a legal multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to the systematic abuse of children operating in plain sight all across America. It's called the troubled teen industry, TTI, and I assure you, it's a hole you won't be able to climb out of unchanged. I had always known my best friend had a difficult past. She'd mentioned, in vague terms, being sent to a therapeutic boarding school as a teenager for addiction and trauma issues. In my naivete, I pictured a rustic, supportive environment, group therapy classes, maybe some equine therapy. I thought of it as a place that had helped her. I had no idea that for years, she had been a prisoner in a brainwashing cult, and that the help she received was a relentless campaign of psychological torture. The rabbit hole didn't start with a late-night Google search. It started in my living room, with her finally starting to unpack the trauma she had been conditioned to believe was treatment. It was a slow, painful process. At first, it was just small comments, flashes of a memory that didn't sit right with her. As she got older and further away from the institution, the pieces of her past began to look less like therapy and more like abuse. Watching her come to this realization was like watching someone admit, for the very first time, that their marriage is abusive. The shame, the denial, and the sheer terror of reframing your own history was a heartbreaking thing to witness. Through her story, I learned the TTI playbook. It often begins with what they call gooning, illegal kidnapping. Parents sign over temporary guardianship to the program, and in the middle of the night, large strangers enter their child's bedroom, restrain them, and transport them hundreds or thousands of miles away, often without telling them where they're going. My friend described the sheer terror of being woken up and dragged from her home believing she was being abducted. Once there, the treatment began. It wasn't therapy. It was a systematic process of breaking a child's will. She told me about endless days of humiliation, sleep and food deprivation, and forced manual labor. The core of the program was attack therapy, where teenagers prompted by staff are forced to scream at and verbally abuse a single individual for hours on end, breaking them down until they confess to whatever scenes the program wants them to. Communication with the outside world was cut off. Every letter she wrote home was censored. Every phone call was monitored. The goal was to isolate her until her entire reality was contained within the walls of the compound. The most insidious part was the brainwashing. After months of this relentless psychological battery, she started to believe it. She believed she was a broken, horrible person who deserved this punishment. She became a model student. When she turned 18, they offered her a job, a common tactic these places use to keep their victims trapped in the system. She accepted, fully believing she was now helping to save other kids, just like she had been saved. Horrified by her story, I started my own research. I fell down a rabbit hole of documentaries, survivor blogs, and legal documents. I learned about the industry's most infamous poster child, the Elon School in Maine, a place survivors have described as being as close to a concentration camp for children as you could get, complete with a boxing ring, where kids were forced to beat each other as punishment. I learned that Elon was shut down, but that hundreds of similar institutions are still operating today, protected by legal loopholes in states like Utah. I read about celebrity survivors like Paris Hilton, who has used her platform to advocate for the closure of these schools. This wasn't some fringe conspiracy. This is a massive, profitable industry. I learned how these programs are deeply enmeshed with state governments and court systems, with judges sentencing juvenile offenders to these private for-profit facilities. These schools then billed the parents' insurance and even enrolled the kids in Medicaid, double-dipping to pull in government money to subsidize the abuse. It is a grift of the highest, most immoral order, enabled by politicians on both sides of the aisle who have refused to regulate it. But this rabbit hole has a hero, my friend. After years of painstakingly putting the pieces of her reality back together, she got out, and she didn't just run. She turned around and decided to fight. She is now on the front lines of a battle against the very institutions that stole her youth, as she is involved in current litigation. I can't share many details, but I can say this. I have watched her transform her trauma into fuel. She is dismantling the TTI network in her area, piece by piece, with a strength I can only describe as awe-inspiring. She is an absolute queen. This is the most disturbing rabbit hole I've ever explored, not just because of the abuse, but because it is happening right now. It's legal, and it's happening to thousands of kids. The silence surrounding it is deafening, and I can only hope that by sharing this, one more person becomes aware of the horrors that are being committed in the name of tough love. Story 4. It didn't belong to me. There are corners of the internet that functioned like digital curiosity cabinets, displaying the strange and unsettling fringes of the human condition. You can stumble into them by accident, by clicking a random link on a thread about medical oddities or psychological extremes. That's how I found my way into one of the most profoundly disturbing rabbit holes I've ever explored. The online world of body integrity identity disorder, or BIID. It's a place where people don't dream of being richer or more beautiful. They dream of being amputees. Before I fell down this hole, I had never even heard of the condition. But in these hidden forums and blogs, I learned about a rare and powerful psychological disorder where a person feels a complete and total disconnect from a part of their own healthy body. They look at their own arm or their leg and feel with absolute certainty that it's not supposed to be there. It's a foreign object, an alien attachment, and this feeling creates a deep, obsessive, all-consuming desire to have that perfectly healthy limb removed. They believe amputation is the only way to make their physical body align with their true internal self-image. The blogs were a bizarre landscape of macabre fantasy and grim determination. People would write detailed posts about their ideal body, sharing fantasies about what life would be like with a prosthetic hook for a hand or with both legs ending at the knee. They shared tips on how to simulate the experience, and in the darkest corners, they shared their plans for how to make it a reality. since no sane surgeon will amputate a healthy limb. It was a world of wannabes, people who wanted, more than anything, to be disabled. Amidst the forums and general discussion, one blog stood out. It was a personal, detailed, and horrifically graphic chronicle written by a man from South Africa. His obsession was his left foot. In his posts, he wrote with a strange, calm clarity about how he knew, on a fundamental level, that the foot wasn't his. He didn't hate it, but its presence was a source of constant psychological agony. He had decided to take matters into his own hands. His plan was something out of a medieval horror story. He announced to his small blog following that he was going to force an amputation by inducing an infection so severe that doctors have no choice but to remove the foot. His method was stomach churning. He would systematically cut his foot with a knife and then submerge it in a bucket filled with his own feces and other bacteria-rich filth. The most disturbing part of the entire rabbit hole was that he documented the process with a daily photo diary. With a kind of detached scientific rigor, he posted high-resolution pictures of the results. I scrolled through the archives, watching a perfectly healthy human foot decay in slow motion. Day 1 was the initial cuts. By day 5 it was red and swollen. By day 10 the skin was beginning to turn a mottled purple and black. He wrote captions describing the escalating pain, the smell, and his strange sense of accomplishment as the necrosis set in. It was a methodical, deliberate act of self-mutilation, presented as a personal journey toward wholeness. I was watching a man rot himself from the foot up, and I couldn't look away. Then, one day the posts just stopped. The daily updates, which had been so consistent, vanished. The blog was silent. I, along with the other anonymous lurkers, was left to imagine the inevitable conclusion. Had the infection finally killed him? Had he been discovered and institutionalized? The silence stretched on for weeks. Finally, a new post appeared. It was the man. He wrote that he had nearly died. The sepsis from the raging infection had overwhelmed his body, and he had collapsed in his bathroom, where he was eventually found by his landlord, unconscious and near death. He was rushed to the hospital. And then came the final, triumphant paragraph of his post. The infection in his foot had been so catastrophic, the tissue so completely dead, that the doctors had been unable to save it. He had woken up in the hospital, and his foot was gone. He had gotten his wish. His tone wasn't one of regret or trauma, it was one of pure, unadulterated joy. He wrote about the profound sense of peace he felt, looking down at the bandaged stump where the alien foot had once been. He had risked his life and endured unimaginable agony, but in his mind, he had won. His body was finally correct. That rabbit hole has stuck with me unlike any other. It wasn't about a monster or a ghost. It was about a fundamental schism in a person's own mind, a form of mental anguish so profound that rotting your own flesh off felt like a logical solution. It was a terrifying glimpse into a reality where self-destruction is the only path to feeling whole. Story 5. Enough to make a man vomit when we think about the horrors of the Second World War. Our minds tend to go to a specific set of images. A well-documented and monstrous narrative centered around the industrial-scale evil of the Nazi regime. We know the names: Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka. We've seen the footage and read the testimonies. It's a defined and understood corner of human darkness. But one night, clicking through a series of links that started with the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s and led me backward in time, I fell into a rabbit hole about a theater of that same war that was so uniquely savage it left me physically ill. I learned about the Croatian Ustashi and their concentration camp just set. Yugoslavia during World War II wasn't just a battleground. It was a vicious, multi-sided civil war wrapped inside a world war. The rabbit hole began for me with the Ustashi, a Croatian fascist movement that rose to power with the help of the Axis powers. I learned that they weren't just Nazi puppets. They were zealous partners driven by a rabid ultranationalism and a fanatical brand of Catholicism. Their ideology targeted hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma people for extermination. But what set their campaign of genocide apart was its character. While the Nazis often perfected a cold industrial efficiency in their killing, the Ustases' methods were intimate, personal, and sadistically The dark heart of this rabbit hole is the Jasenovac concentration camp complex, sometimes called the Auschwitz of the Balkans. As I read the historical accounts and survivor testimonies, I realized this place was different. Jasenovac was not primarily equipped with gas chambers. The killing was a manual, laborious, and gruesome affair. The guards used knives, hammers, mallets, and saws. It was a place of unbelievable personal cruelty. I descended deeper, reading stories that I wish I could forget. I learned of the infamous contests held among the Ustashi guards to see who could liquidate the most prisoners in a single night, with the winner being crowned king of the cutthroats. I read about torture methods designed for maximum suffering, about families being murdered in front of each other, about a level of depravity so profound it seemed to defy human comprehension. This wasn't the detached cruelty of a bureaucrat signing an order. This was the passionate, frenzied violence of men who enjoyed their work. It was a celebration of sadism, but the single fact that truly defines this rabbit hole, the detail that lodged itself in my brain and will never leave, came from an unexpected source. The Nazis themselves, the Ustashi, were their allies, a key part of their vision for the region. A high-ranking member of the Nazi Party, a man who was an architect of the Holocaust, and no stranger to mass death, paid a visit to the newly established Croatian puppet state. He was given a tour. He witnessed, with his own eyes, the Ustash's methods and the conditions at their camps. This man, an individual from the epicenter of one of the greatest evils in human history, was so thoroughly disgusted by what he saw that he was quoted as saying the violence was enough to make a man vomit. Another German official who witnessed it remarked that what happened at Jasenovac was something no mortal man could bear to witness. Let that sink in. The Ustash's brand of cruelty was so extreme, so personal, and so utterly barbaric that it managed to horrify the very people who were actively engineering the Holocaust. When you have outmonstered the Nazis, you have entered a unique and truly godless category of evil. This rabbit hole didn't just teach me about a forgotten chapter of history, it fundamentally altered my understanding of human evil. It's one thing to read about systematic state-sanctioned murder. It's another thing entirely to read about a place where the act of killing was a sport, where the suffering of the victims was the primary source of entertainment. It revealed a pocket of human history so dark that even the most infamous villains of the 20th century were repulsed by it. It's a reminder that even when you think you've seen the bottom of humanity's capacity for cruelty, there is always a deeper, darker level waiting to be discovered. Story 7. The memorial page. Some internet rabbit holes are journeys of detached curiosity. You start by looking up something morbid, something you know you shouldn't, but the pull is too strong for me. That started with websites that host post-mortem photographs of celebrities. It's a grim, unsettling corner of the internet, but for most who visit, it feels distant. You see the final, tragic image of someone like Chris Farley, and you feel a brief, sad shock. But it's a historical artifact. It's a tragedy that belongs to someone else, far away. I used to think of it as a passing macabre curiosity. I had no idea that I would soon have a personal front row seat to the predatory world that creates and consumes this kind of content, and that my own family would become the target. The abstract horror of those websites became a raw, personal reality last Halloween. My brother, along with a close friend, took his own life while they were hiking on Mount Rainier. The news was a cataclysm that shattered our family, a profound and incomprehensible loss that we are still struggling to navigate. In the initial fog of grief, we dealt with the police, the coroners, and the impossible logistics of tragedy. We thought we had reached the bottom of our pain. We were wrong. A few days later, we learned how they were found. A group of hikers had come across their bodies. These hikers didn't just call for help. First, they took out their cameras, and they didn't take pictures for the authorities. They took them for sport. We soon discovered that these graphic, horrific photos of our deepest personal tragedy had been uploaded to a niche, grotesque corner of the internet, a death fetish site for gay men. Our family's most private, devastating moment was stolen from us and turned into pornographic material for a community of online ghouls. The rabbit hole was no longer something I was looking down. It was a pit that had opened up beneath my family, and we were being dragged into it. Somehow, information from the site leaked. My brother's name, details of his death, and links to our social media profiles began to circulate in these dark communities. And then the harassment started. It was a relentless, unimaginable violation. Strangers would message me, my parents, my relatives, asking for more pictures. They wanted more graphic details. They treated our loss as a piece of content they were entitled to consume. They desecrated his memorial page, the place we had created online for friends and family to share. Loving memories and grieve together was swarmed by trolls and perverts. They would post cruel, taunting messages, blaming my family for his death, mocking his suicide, making vile jokes. Every day, we had to moderate this sacred space, deleting comments and blocking profiles, fighting a constant battle to protect our brother's memory from these vultures. My family has tried to cope. Most of us have learned, out of necessity, how to deal with the anonymous cruelty of the internet. We know how to block, to ignore, to build walls around ourselves to survive the onslaught, but it destroys my mom. Every day, this grieving mother has to see strangers from the internet celebrate and sexualize the death of her son. There is no armor for that kind of pain. It is a fresh wound, torn open again and again by people who see our tragedy as their entertainment. This experience gave me a final, sickening clarity about the purpose of these communities. My initial, detached browsing of celebrity death photos felt harmless, because I saw it as a passing curiosity, but I was wrong. The people who frequent these sites are not just curious. This is an active community that seeks out corpses for their gratification. They are, as the original post said, highly messed up at best, and considering some of the threats we've received, they are likely extremely dangerous. My journey down this rabbit hole was not a choice. It was an invasion. It taught me the most brutal lesson the internet has to offer. Tragedy, when filtered through a screen, can feel like abstract content, but behind every headline, every shocking image, every story, there are real people drowning in a pain you can't imagine. And the darkest corners of the web are not just passive archives of morbid history. They are active, Predatory communities capable of reaching out of the digital world to inflict fresh waves of suffering on those who have already lost everything.